Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffronolive, and it's time for our first official daily dose of March of the Machine spoilers, and good God, do we have a lot of insanely awesome Magic cards to talk about today. Today is, I believe, the biggest spoiler day in the history of spoiler days. There are so many things spoiled, but this is a special spoiler day. Not only do we have just a ton of sweet new cards and new mechanics in the new set, we got brand new card types, which are ridiculous. We know what battles are now. We got the return of so many iconic characters. We have an absurd amount to talk about, which means this video is going to be incredibly long, so we should probably jump right into it, start talking amazing new March of the Machines cards. Before we do, two quick reminders. Number one, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our awesome sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish. And number two, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout spoiler season, you should head on over to mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk March of the Machines. Alright, so we gotta start with the big news, what everyone has been waiting for, the new battle card type. And I gotta say, wow, battles are ridiculous. They are way better than I expected. When Mark Rosewater said March of the Machines was going to change Magic, I kind of took it with a grain of salt because Mark gets so hyped about everything. But now that we can see the battles, wow, 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 wow. I don't think he was exaggerating it. These cards are going to have a huge impact on the game. So we're going to start with a simple little uncommon just to explain how the mechanic works. And then we'll talk about some of the spicy ones. There are 36 battles in the set, and there could be more in future sets. All the battles in March of the Machines are siege battles, so they're all going to work the same way, but there could be different types in the future. So anyway, what are battles, how they work? Let's look at Invasion of Zendikar. So Invasion of Zendikar, it is a 4-mana green battle. It's a siege like all the other battles in the set. It comes into play with 3 defense counters that number down in the right-hand corner. Easiest way to think of these is the same as loyalty counters, essentially. They're like loyalty counters for the battle. They're going to work almost exactly the same way as loyalty counters. So when Invasion of Zendikar comes into play, you just search for 2 basic lands, put them into play tapped. As it comes into play, you're going to choose an opponent to protect the battle. You can attack it, and if you're playing Commander, other people at the table can attack it. And then once the battle is defeated, which means once those 3 defense counters are removed, you're going to exile it, and then you get to cast the back half of the battle, which in this case is Awakened Skyclave, a 4/4 elemental with vigilance and haste that's also a land and taps to add a mana of any color. So if you think about this card, I think it is absolutely ridiculous. Just discounting the backside for a minute, this is explosive vegetation, but it's like explosive vegetation on steroids. If you think back to the early days of Magic, creatures used to be really bad. And what Wizards did to make creatures good, and now creatures are absurd, is they started giving creatures enter the battlefield abilities to make them work like spells. I feel like we are seeing the same thing happen here with battles, which are essentially sorcery-like abilities, and you play them at sorcery speed, so they essentially work like sorceries, except they're permanent, and that makes them way more powerful. Invasion of Zendikar, it is essentially an explosive vegetation, except you can blink it every turn with Brago to keep getting more lands. You can bounce it back to your hand with Into the Royal, recast it to get more lands. You can double up its ETB trigger to get twice as many lands with Elesh Norn or Yarok. So this is like the best explosive vegetation of all time, and that's not even including that eventually you can flip it into Awakened Skyclave, into a 4/4 vigilant, hasty, Birds of Paradise style creature. As far as flipping it, most of the time, the way you're going to flip it is just by attacking it. Like I said, the easiest way to visualize these defense counters is just like loyalty counters on a Planeswalker. So your opponent has Invasion of Zendikar. You need to deal 3 damage to it to defeat the battle and get to cast the backside of it. So the easiest way to do this is going to be by just attacking it. Like you have a Blood Tithe Harvester and you attack, it goes unblocked, it hits Invasion of Zendikar. That removes the 3 defense counters. You get the Awakened Skyclave. But that's not the only way. You can also cast burn spells that say any target. Like Stoke the Flames, Unfortunately, this is an old version of Stoke the Flames. It's been errated to say any target. Anything that said creature or player before the errata says any target now. But you can cast a burn spell like a lightning bolt or a Stoke the Flames and hit the invasion of Zendikar to remove the defense counters and flip it. You can even use like Vampire Hexmage or Hex Parasite to remove the counters manually and flip it. So that is essentially how these cards play. As I mentioned though, there's a ton of these cards, and Invasion of Zendikar is one of the simple ones. Here is Invasion of New Phyrexia. Invasion of New Phyrexia is blue, white, and X. It's a same thing, a Battle of Siege. It comes into play with 6 defense counters, and when it comes into play, you get to make X 2/2 white and blue knight creature tokens with Vigilance. And then the backside, should you defeat the battle, is a new Teferi Akros of Zelfir. So Teferi, +1, draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards unless you discard a creature card. -2, you get an emblem with knights you control, get +1/+0 and have ward 1. Synergizes well with the front side. You make a bunch of knights, then you pump the knights. Since Teferi comes into play with 4 loyalty, you can even -2 twice to get 2 emblems without upticking, and then -3, tap X target creatures you control. When you do, shuffle target non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value X or less into its owner's library. So the thing that makes this card so ridiculous, and this is going to stand for essentially every battle we've seen so far, is there is no tax for the upside. Double mana and then X to make X 2/2s, that is the going rate. Look at Finale of Glory. It is essentially the same thing. Sure, you get this upside that if you cast it for 10 or more mana, you upgrade your tokens, but double mana and then X, that's the rate of most cards that are going to make 2/2 tokens at sorcery speed. So this is already on rate as it is. If there was no backside, no defense counters, no Teferi, this would already be a playable card, but then you get the upside that you can flip it into a Teferi. It's not just the front side of the card. So these battles are super, super ridiculous. Probably the weirdest thing about this is it's Azorius Knight support and a Teferi that actually cares about knights. Was not expecting Knight Teferi. If you think of Teferi's abilities, assuming you do flip it, and I think flipping at some points is going to be a trap. Like, I think people are going to focus too much on how do I get Teferi out of my Invasion of New Phyrexia. You don't need to do that to make this card good. You don't need Teferi to make Invasion of New Phyrexia worth it. Just the knights are worth it. If you played this like a sorcery and never attacked it a single time, never removed a defense counter from it, that's already a good card. That's already enough to be a playable card. But let's assume you do attack it and get rid of those loyalty counters and flip to Teferi. You get a pretty good Planeswalker. Its +1 is kind of a thirst for knowledge, except for creatures, essentially, rather than discarding artifacts. The -2, a Lord almost for knights, with Ward being a nice bit of protection. Stacking up those wards is especially powerful. And then you get some removal for the ultimate. So a pretty reasonable Planeswalker for some sort of blue-white knight deck. Mostly, though, I'm hyped because this might finally mean that the Circle of Loyalty can actually work. Circle of Loyalty, I've wanted this card to be good forever. Notoriously, one of my picks is best cards from Throne of Eldraine, which didn't age that well. But maybe seeing this new blue-white knight support, an Invasion of New Phyrexia, and Teferi, maybe that finally makes a Circle of Loyalty work at older formats. But either way, this is another super strong card. You get an on-rate token producer, potentially can flip it around to a Planeswalker, and then those same shenanigans of like bouncing it back to your hand and reusing it or whatever, that applies to this card as well. We also got Invasion of Tolvada, which I have no idea what Tolvada is. Is that actually a plane in Magic? What plane is that from? But Invasion of Tolvada, which is a 5-mana Orzhov battle. It comes into play with 5 defense counters. It says, when it enters the battlefield, return target non-land permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then its backside, should you defeat it, the Broken Sky, an enchantment that says, creature tokens you control get +1/+0 and have lifelink, and the beginning of your end step, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying, which will obviously be a 2/1 with lifelink, assuming you have the Broken Sky on the battlefield. And this is another example of how there's really no tax for the upside of this card. If you think about just the front side of the battle, it is quite literally Obsidian. Same exact mana cost, only difference is it's a battle instead of a sorcery, but battles you play at sorcery speed, so it works exactly the same. Or even like Invoke Justice, 5 mana to reanimate a permanent. You get some counters out of it, but it also has a very restrictive mana cost. So the front side of this card is the going rate to reanimate a permanent from your graveyard. And then you get the upside that maybe you're animated Atraxa and you hit the battle and get to flip it, and you end up with a Bitter Blossom / Intangible Virtue. The Broken Sky is actually very strong, getting a 1/1 every single turn, and it starts on your end step. So you're going to get it the first turn that you flip, by having it actually be a 2/1 flying with lifelink. That's a really powerful effect. So I could see Invasion of Tolvada showing up in Reanimator decks. It'll be interesting to see how this shakes out. Like, is this better than Invoke Justice? Is it better than the Cruelty of Gix? We've seen these 5-mana reanimation spells be pretty popular in Standard. Getting back Atraxas and Titans of Industry, it might just be that Invasion is better because you can reanimate the Atraxa, attack, flip, and then get this Bitter Blossom with tons of upside going. The backside is actually really sweet in token decks. If you got Mondrak and Wedding Announcements and those synergies going, it can get out of control really quickly. So another really, really solid battle that just, there's no tax. I'm blown away. This is reminding me of Energy. Do you remember Energy and how busted that was in Standard 6 or 7 years ago? And what made Energy so busted was the cards that made Energy were already on rate. Your Rogue Refiners and Whirler Virtuosos, those were already on curve cards, and then you just got Energy as a bonus. It's like you got the Energy for free for playing already good cards. I feel like these battles are the same. Like, the front sides as pseudo sorceries that are not sorceries, they're actually battles, but they work just like sorceries. They are already on rate. There's no tax going on here. And then you get all this upside to the backside and potentially flipping it and getting a very powerful effect there as well. So these cards are just blowing me away. Speaking of blowing me away, we have a colorless battle that not only is a colorless battle, but might be the best colorless removal spell of all time, Invasion of Ravnica. So 5 colorless mana. Its front side is, when it enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls that isn't exactly 2 colors. So that's a little bit of a drawback. It's not going to hit a Blood Tithe Harvester, let's say, but that'll snipe pretty much any non-land that you want it to. And then the backside, should you defeat its 4 defense counters, is a 5/5 construct called Guildpact Paragon, which says whenever you cast a spell that's exactly 2 colors, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a card that's exactly 2 colors from among it and put it in your hand, put the rest on the bottom in a random order. So the backside is like a ridiculous payoff for playing 2 color spells. And notice, no once per turn restriction. Like, you can just keep chaining things together and dig through your deck once you get Guildpact Paragon on the battlefield. So the front side, I honestly think it's in the conversation, at least, for best colorless removal spell. Colorless removal, just especially target removal, isn't that great. Like, Scour from Existence is a somewhat playable card just because you don't get that many targeted removal spells that are colorless. We've recently gotten Mightstone and Weakstone, which only hits creatures, obviously. But I think that Invasion of Ravnica, unless you're playing in a particularly 2-color heavy meta, is just a really, really solid removal spell. And then the backside, it's perfect for something like Niv Mizzet Reborn. It reminds me of Niv Mizzet Reborn, caring about the same thing, exactly 2-color spells. And I think you'd play Guildpact Paragon in a Niv deck. You kill something and then get the backside by attacking down the battle with Niv, and then whenever you cast an Azorius Charm, you dig 5 cards deep to grab another 2-colored spell. Can you imagine chaining together Burning Tree Emissaries? You play one, hopefully dig, find another one, play that one with the mana from the first one, do it again, do it again. The no once per turn restriction is absurd. If you build around this card, it can go off so hard. So I think that this card actually has some modern potential. I think there's a chance this could show up in the sideboard of like Tron decks. If you're a colorless deck that just really doesn't have access to good removal, this is going to be a go-to card that can get rid of a troubling enchantment, get rid of that Blood Moon that's keeping your Tron lands from turning on, can get rid of creatures, can get rid of planeswalkers. It is a very, very flexible effect. Yes, there will be some fringe things that it doesn't hit because of the no exactly 2-color restriction, but I think this is a premier removal spell for colorless decks, and that goes for Commander as well. If you're playing a colorless Commander deck, Ulamog or Hope of Gurupur, this is almost an auto-include. Even though the backside's not going to do anything for you, that's fine. The front side is so good at being removal and so much better than the other options you have access to. You would play it purely for the front side in your colorless Commander deck, and then the backside, I'm sure there's other 2-color decks as well, but seems especially especially designed to just like go off with Niv Mizzet Reborn. So again, another really, really powerful battle. This card type is just absolutely insane. This set is insane. I am blown away. I am so hyped. Oh my goodness. But we got a ton of cards to talk about, so we got to keep going. We also got another random uncommon battle in Invasion of Dominaria. So 3 mana white battle, 5 defense counters. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life and draw a card. And then the backside is Sarah's Faithkeeper, a 4/4 flying Vigilant Angel. So this one's pretty simple, maybe the least powerful of the battles we've seen so far, but its front side is Ritual of Rejuvenation, which if you want to gain some life for some reason is not a horrible effect. Again, it's still on rate. Like if you want to gain 4 life and draw a card, it costs 3 mana. Like I guess it's a sorcery speed effect rather than instant, but still it's pretty close. And then the backside, it's literally a Sarah Angel with a different name. So this one probably mostly for limited, but not impossible that we could see it show up in some sort of control deck just to stabilize life totals out of the sideboard. We also got, my god, this card, another ridiculous battle, an Invasion of Tarkir. So Invasion of Tarkir, 2 mana, 5 defense counters. It is a red battle. It says, when it enters the battlefield, reveal any number of dragon cards from your hand. When you do, Invasion of Tarkir deals X plus 2 damage to any other target, where X is the number of cards revealed this way. So essentially, the front side of this is 2 mana sorcery speed shock, but if you reveal a dragon, you can get 4 damage instead. If you reveal 2 dragons, 6 damage instead. And then if you can defeat this battle, you get Defiant Thundermaw, a 4/4 flying trample dragon. This says when a dragon you control attacks, it deals 2 damage to any target, turns all of your dragon's attacks into shocks. So this card, on one hand, I don't think it's quite good enough to play without dragons. I guess you could, maybe, but then it's a 2 mana sorcery speed shock, which that honestly is not playable. You really need to be able to reveal at least 1 dragon to it, because just shocking something for 2 mana sorcery speed isn't good. On the other hand, if you have a single dragon in hand, and this is 4 damage to any target for 2 mana, that's a very good card. Then you're at Stoke the Flames level. If you have 2 dragons in hand and you're getting 6 damage to any target, then you're getting to the busted level of this card, where this is just going to be absolutely ridiculous. So in a deck with dragons, this is a incredibly powerful burn/removal spell. Also worth mentioning, this is a good way to flip your battles. You can't use Invasion of Tarkir to flip itself, but if you have another battle on the battlefield, that is a legitimate target for this damage to get those defense counters out of there and flip it into whatever is on the backside. So very good removal/burn spell for a dragon deck. The backside is also ridiculous in a dragon deck. Honestly, it's pretty good just by itself. It essentially is like a Thorncaster Sliver, but for dragons, and you get 2 damage instead of 1 damage. It almost turns all of your dragons into mini Inferno Titans. Like, when you attack with a dragon, 2 damage to any target, you are going to close out the game so quickly once you start attacking. So the only question for this card is, do we have enough dragons to make it work? We haven't really had a dragon deck in Standard recently, but I was looking through the dragons, and I think the answer is yes. Like, if you want to build a dragon tribal deck, the pieces exist. So one possibility is just go kind of 5-color or 3-color dragon mid-range. We got like Rivaz, really good in that style of deck. AO, Rith, Shivan Devastator. There's plenty of dragons to pull this off. In that style of deck, the burn mode of Invasion of Tarkir is ridiculous. And then if you do flip it, Defiant Thundermaw is also going to be ridiculous. Another sneaky way to go about this is to build kind of a spell slingery style dragon deck. Think of like Mana Form Hellkite. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you're getting this dragon illusion token with flying and haste, but it's going to go away at the end of turn. If you can actually get Defiant Thundermaw on the battlefield and sling some spells, those dragon tokens are just going to burn your opponent out of the game in 1 attack thanks to Defiant Thundermaw's ability. And then, of course, if you're playing a dragon commander deck, play this card every single time. It's going to be amazing. Like, it's going to be a fine removal removal spell if you're playing a dragon deck, because remember, most dragons are expensive. So on turn 2, on turn 3, you're likely going to have several in hand. So this should just be killing anything. And then later in the game, you're going to be able to flip it and get a very powerful dragon out of it as well. So Invasion of Tarkir, another really good battle. We'll see if it can actually find its way in Standard. I think its power level is there. It's strong enough to see Standard play. The only question is, can we make a dragon deck work? Is someone going to figure out how to put that together? Definitely going to try, because this card is sweet. Worst case, new Commander All-Star for dragon decks. Of course, there's more to March of the Machines than just battles. For example, we got another Elesh Norn, is just simply Elesh Norn. Another one of the Praetors that flips into a saga, and my goodness, these cards are super hard to evaluate. So the front side of Elesh Norn, 4 mana, legendary Phyrexian Praetor. It's a 3/5 with vigilance. It says whenever a source an opponent controls deals damage to you or a permanent you control, that source's controller loses 2 life unless they pay 1 mana. And then you can pay 3 mana, sacrifice 3 other creatures, exile Elesh Norn, return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control, activate it only as a sorcery. And the backside of Elesh Norn is a saga, and this card is one of the most absurd Magic cards I have seen in a while, the Argent Etchings. So lore counter number 1, incubate 2 5 times, then transform all your incubator tokens. Lore counter 2, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain double strike until end of turn. Lore counter 3, destroy all other permanents except for artifacts, lands, and Phyrexians. Then you exile it, return it back to the battlefield as Elesh Norn, start the process over again. So on one hand, the front side of Elesh Norn, it's kind of okay. Like, it's not exciting. A 3/5 even with vigilance for 4 is kind of meh. Like, its protection mode is interesting. It's going to be very good against go wide decks. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Norn's Annex to some extent, where yes, your opponent can still attack you and can still damage your stuff, but it's going to be pretty punishing. Either they're going to need mana to pay or they're going to lose some life, and there could be situations against like token decks, because remember, this is for each source that deals you damage. So if your opponent has 4 1/1 flying tokens, they're going to have to pay 1 for each of those or lose 2 life for each of those if they want to attack you and deal combat damage. So there is a bit of protection here, but the real payoff is actually flipping this. If you can flip into the saga, the backside of this card is absolutely just absurd. It is absurd. So first off, incubate 2 5 times. Incubate's a new mechanic in the set. It's essentially like clues or food, except you turn them into creature tokens. So in incubate, as we see on Merciless Repurposing, you create an incubator token with the number of counters on it equal to its incubate number. So for Elesh Norn or the Argent Etchings, it'll have 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and then you have to pay 2 mana and you transform it into a 0/0 Phyrexian artifact creature. So just like clues or food, it's an artifact token that does nothing, but then for 2 mana it does something. Food is going to gain you life, clue is going to draw you a card. In this case, it's going to turn into a Phyrexian creature. So what the Argent Etchings does is it makes 5 of those with 2 counters on them each, and then more importantly, it flips them all. It's going to transform them all into creatures, so you're not going to have to spend that 2 mana to flip it, and 2 mana to flip it, and 2 mana to flip it. So what this essentially means is it is going to make 5 2/2s with its first lore counter. Look at like Revel of the Fallen God. That makes 4 2/2s, and it costs 7 mana. Like, that is a lot of mana worth of tokens, and because they have counters on them, you can proliferate them. If you got Mondrak, you'll make twice as many of them. If you have other incubates on the battlefield, those are going to flip too. So it's even better than just 5 2/2s. And then you're getting double strike and +1/+1 for your team of 5 2/2s plus whatever else you got on the battlefield, which is probably just going to close out the game, Berserker's Onslaught style. And if that's not enough, you're going to get this supercharge in Garruk's Wake, where you're not going to lose your incubates because they're Phyrexians. You're not going to lose Elesh Norn. You're not going to lose your other Phyrexians if you have other Phyrexians in your deck, but your opponent is in theory going to lose all their stuff unless they happen to be a Phyrexian deck or an artifact deck. So this super one-sided wrath that's destroying everything, and then your Elesh Norn comes back to start the process over. I don't think that's going to happen very often, because I think that if you actually get to the Ardent Etchings, odds are the second lore counter is just going to close out the game. The game is just going to end. But if for some reason it doesn't, it's going to keep going. So like I said, this is a very, very tricky card to evaluate because the front side is honestly pretty medium. You're really playing it for the backside, which is honestly just one of the most absurd sagas I've ever seen. How easy is it going to be to get to that backside? You got to pay 4 for Norn. You got to have 3 other creatures. You got to have 3 mana to sacrifice those creatures. You got to do it at sorcery speed. Like, are you going to be able to get there consistently enough? I think the answer is going to be maybe. Like, we have a lot of pieces to make this work. If you look at some of the white decks in Standard, you got Mondrak to double your tokens, which works with the saga side of Elesh Norn, but also just gives you a bunch of bodies to sacrifice. Wedding Announcement makes easy bodies. Spirited Companion, Ambitious Farmhand, really popular in white decks in Standard. So there's plenty of these just kind of useless, dorky white creatures that you don't really mind sacrificing. So I think there might be enough pieces to make it work, but it is a lot of mana. So we're going to have to wait and see. We've just never seen a card like this before, other than, I guess, the new Jin Gitaxias, which is worded very similar to lead to this and works kind of the same way, where the front side's kind of mad, but the back side's kind of busted. So we're going to have to wait and see. If you can flip this, it is going to win you the game. It is almost certainly going to close out the game within a couple of turns because it just adds so much power and toughness to the battlefield. Can you flip it consistently enough? That's what we're going to have to see about Elesh Norn. We also got another team up, and I love this card. I was hoping we'd get a Fblthp team up. We have Borborygmos and Fblthp, a new 5-mana teamer, legendary Cyclops homunculus, team One Eye. You get a 6/5. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you draw a card. Then you can discard any number of land cards. When you discard one or more cards this way, Borborygmos and Fblthp deals twice that much damage to target creature. That's a lot of text to say. ETB, draw a card, discard a land, or more than one land, and for each land you discard, you get that much ×2 damage, and then you can pay 1 and a blue to put Borborygmos and Fblthp on the top of its owner's library, 3rd from the top. So if your opponent goes to kill it or something, you can just cheat it back on your deck, do it again the next turn. So this calls back to Borborygmos' ability to use lands for damage. Unfortunately, new Borborygmos can't go face. Part of the power of like Borborygmos Enraged, if it's not getting Pithing Needled, is that it can just throw a bunch of lands at your opponent's face like lightning bolts and close out the game. Borborygmos and Fblthp not going to be able to do that. It only hits creatures. And then you get Fblthp's kind of like going back in your library in card draw mode. So it's a really cool matchup to see these two creatures together. Plus, you're getting a really big body. I mean, yes, you are in 3 colors, so you do need to be in Teamer. We don't really have a Teamer deck in Standard at the moment, so it's going to have to kind of create its new archetype. But a 5-mana 6/5 with a ETB trigger, that's an above the curve effect. That's a Cavalier of Flame stats or Battle Mammoth stats. Plus, because you're getting its ETB, it's kind of like the world's biggest Ravenous Chupacabra or something. If you can discard a land, the first land, if you discard 1, you get to shock a creature, so good at killing little things. If you can discard 2 lands, then you're getting obliterating bolt damage, where you can probably kill a bigger thing. And if you can discard a bunch of lands, then you can probably just kill whatever. So I think Borborygmos and Fblthp, it's a powerful card. I don't know where this card fits. Like I said, there's no Teamer deck in Standard, so it's not like, oh, we just slot this in and go to town. But it's got a good ETB. It's got good stats. It kills things. It generates card advantage. Also worth mentioning, the discard a land mode, that's optional. This can just be a super huge Spirited Companion where you just play this and draw a card and you treat it like a normal creature. And then when you attack, you draw another card, which has a little bit of like Grave Titan or Sun Titan built into it. So I really love this card. I love the flavor of the card. I am on Team One Eye. I don't know what to do with it exactly, but I think it's of a power level that if you can find a home for this, it can definitely win you games. Speaking of spicy mythics, we also got the final member of the Sword of X and Y cycle. This is a cycle that's been in the works for 20 years now, and we finally got the 10th and final member. So sort of once in the future, 3-mana equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, has protection from blue and black, the missing protection colors. When it deals combat damage to a player, surveil 2, Then you can cast an instant or sorcery spell with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard without playing its mana cost. If the spell would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. This is a very, very strong sword. If you think about what this sword does, it's essentially sort of mission briefing. You get in an attack with it, you surveil 2, which is probably the equivalent of drawing a card, and then you literally draw a card because you get to cast a cheap instant or sorcery from your graveyard for free. Mission briefing lets you snapcaster a spell, but you got to spend mana on it. Sort of Once and Future does that without any mana at all. So I think this card is really, really good. It's filling your graveyard, it's generating card advantage, it's letting you use your graveyard like a resource. Remember, you can cast any instant or sorcery mana value 2 or less from your graveyard. It doesn't have to be a card you just surveilled into your graveyard. Anything chilling in your graveyard can work. There's a ton of flexibility here. So obviously, if you want to go full on meme mode, this is going to be great in the Surveil deck. We recently got the Surveil errata, which made cards like Thoughtbound Phantasm, Dimir Spybug, Disinformation Campaign much more powerful because there's more Surveil payoffs. Sort of Once and Future is going to let you Surveil every single turn. So it's going to be growing your Spybugs, letting you pick up your Disinformation Campaign. But this isn't just a meme card. You don't have to play some memey Surveil deck. This is, I think, pretty close to Sword of Fire and Ice's power level. If you think about iconic swords, top tier swords, I think that Sword of Once and Future is on par with the best swords in this cycle. If you think about what it really does, it essentially is going to pseudo draw you a card with Surveil. The Surveil 2 I would value is roughly equivalent to Sword of Fire and Ice's drawing you a card, and then Sword of Fire and Ice deals 2 damage to a creature or player, with Sword of Once and Future lets you flash back a free instant or sorcery from your graveyard, which is probably more than 2 damage. It can be a Fatal Push, it can be a Go for the Throw, it can be an Abrade, it can be a Consider, it can be Destroy Evil, it can be any of these things. So unless your graveyard gets shut down by a Rest in Peace or something, this is very snowbally repeatable value that's just gonna keep happening. Once you get back to older formats, it gets even more ridiculous because then you have like Fatal Push and Lightning Bolt and Certain Visions. Pretty much all the good spells in a format like Modern or Legacy, outside of like Forces or whatever, are gonna be 2 mana or less. So this is just letting you reuse your best spells every single turn as you get in combat damage. So Sword of Once and Future, I really truly believe this is a top tier sword. I think it's one of the best swords in the entire cycle. My only question for this card is, I'm not sure swords as an archetype of cards are really good enough anymore. As sad as it is to say this, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, these cards were so good, but even a really strong sword like Sword of Once and Future, you gotta cast it for 3, you gotta pay 2 to equip it. It's just kinda slow by 2023 standards, so it'll be interesting to see. We haven't seen Sword of Fortune Frontier really take off anywhere yet, and that's another sword that's pretty powerful. I think Once in the Future is on par with that, and maybe even better than that, because Protection from Black is one of the best protection colors to keep your creature from dying to removal, so I think this is a really good sword, but are swords good at all anymore? I guess we'll have to wait and see. We also got, speaking of mashups, Zurgo and Ojutai. So Zurgo and Ojutai, 5 mana Jeskai, legendary Orc Dragon. It's a 4/4 with flying and haste. It has hexproof as long as it entered the battlefield this turn, and when 1 or more dragons you control deals combat damage to a player, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them in your hand, the rest on the bottom in a random order, and then you may return 1 of those dragons to its owner's hand. I don't know exactly why you'd want to do that. I guess it's to protect the dragon from sorcery speed removal. Like, you could get in an attack with your Zurgo and Ojutai. It's going to have hexproof, so it's not going to die to an instant speed removal spell. And then you could just bounce it back to your hand and do it again the next turn and do it again the next turn to always dodge a farewell or something. So this calls back to Zurgo Helm Smasher. You get the hasty, huge attack out of nowhere. And then Dragonlord Ojutai, which has the anticipate, dig 3 cards deep, put something into your hand ability. So it really does mash up those 2 cards pretty well. We've seen similar cards at 5 mana, 4/4 hasty dragons be very good in standard. Glorybringer, Goldspan Dragon, Stormbreath Dragon. Each of those has the same stats, the same abilities. They have different upsides, removal, getting bigger, making treasure tokens, but I think that Zurgo and Ojutai could have a chance, similarly to Borborygmos and Fblthp. I don't know where this card fits in Standard. Like, we don't really have a Jeskai deck that's looking for a hasty 4/4 flyer. Maybe one will develop to take advantage of this, some sort of like Jeskai mid-range, with this being a card advantage engine and finisher and solid mid-range threat. But when you add it all together, this looks like a card that has potential to be playable. One of the things I really love about this card is actually its commander implications. Dragons are super popular in Commander. However, we don't really have a good Jeskai Dragon commander. There's plenty of 5-color Dragon commanders, and a lot of 3-color combinations have been getting like relatively iconic Dragon commanders. We got Karthus, we got Nurith, we got Miram, but Jeskai doesn't have a commander like that. So I really like that this gives you a Dragon commander that cares about dragons, that gives you an ability that does something when dragons do something, that is in a color combination that has been lacking one. So if you want to play Jeskai Dragons, I think this is your go-to commander. Plus, I mean, it's going to be perfectly fine just jammed in the Ur-Dragon, jammed in Scion of the Ur-Dragon. So, Zurgo and Ojutai, the card's pretty sweet. Once again, where does it fit in Standard? We don't really have a Jeskai deck. I'm not really sure, but a 5-mana 4/4 hasty flyer with some protection and card advantage built in is a very solid card. We also got another new mechanic in Backup, and Backup is pretty interesting. So we see 3 of the biggest so far Backup cards on screen: Archpriest of Shadows, Boon-Bringer Valkyrie, and Voldaren Thrillseeker. So how Backup works, let's look at Archpriest of Shadows. It's a 5-mana 4/4. It's a human warlock. It has backup 1. And what this means is when it enters the battlefield, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It can target itself, but if it targets another creature, that creature also gains Archpriest of Shadows abilities until end of turn. Its abilities are Death Touch, and when this creature deals combat damage to a player or a battle, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So backup essentially puts a counter on a creature and can give a creature your backup creature's abilities for 1 turn only, which opens up some pretty sneaky lines of attack. So let's talk about these cards. Archpriest of Shadows, it's kind of like Inkai's Servant of Oni, because remember, after you have your backup turn where you play this and you get the ETB and you put a counter on something, you still get to keep the Archpriest of Shadows. So the next turn you still get a 4/4 Death Touch, or that if it hits your opponent or a battle, you get to reanimate something. So it's like a less sneaky version of Inkai's Servant of Oni, although maybe in some ways it's more sneaky because of backup. I think the dream with this card is you get a Trox in the graveyard or whatever, or a Titan of Industry, you got a random little Blood Tithe Harvester out, your opponent's feeling pretty safe, then you Archpriest and you target the Blood Tithe Harvester, you put a counter on it, you give it its reanimation ability and Death Touch, you attack your opponent, you reanimate your big thing, you go on to win the game. Like, that's the dream, and it probably works even better if you have an evasive creature like Orthion that your opponent's going to have a hard time blocking, to guarantee more or less that you get through that reanimation. Although the Death Touch does help. Like, worst case, giving the creature Death Touch means maybe your opponent's got to block your Blood Tithe Harvester with a really good creature and lose it just to keep you from reanimating. So I think it's a pretty powerful ability, especially since, like I mentioned before, the backup creature's still going to stick around with its ability for the future turns. The only question for Archpriest of Shadows is, can it beat out the other options? Like, we know reanimating's good. People love reanimating a Trox and Titan of Industry, but is it better to, like, need a creature and try to Archpriest and try to get in combat damage, or is it better to just Cruelty of Gix and just reanimate my thing and be done with it? Is it going to beat out Invoke Despair, one of the strongest cards in Standard? So I think Archpriest of Shadows, it's powerful. In backup, really improves its abilities a ton. It allows it to do something right away as long as you have another creature on the battlefield. Whether or not it actually makes it in top tier Standard decks, that remains to be seen. Boon-Bringer Valkyrie, kind of similar in a lot of ways. 5-mana 4/4 Flying Angel Warrior, backup 1, and it has Flying, First Strike, and Lifelink. So this can, if you want it to be, literally be a Baneslayer Angel. It's kind of amazing how far Baneslayer Angel has fallen over the past 15 years. When Baneslayer first came out, it was a jaw-dropping goat creature. It was blowing people's minds. Now, Boon-Bringer Valkyrie is arguably just a better Baneslayer Angel, and it's a random uncommon that we're just talking about as the, like, 20th card in our spoiler video. But if you choose to put the backup counter on Boon-Bringer Valkyrie, it's literally Baneslayer, minus the 2 flavorful but not usually super relevant protections. It's a 5/5 flying First Strike Lifelinker. However, you can also get a lot of value by targeting something else. I imagine the dream with this is you like have an Etali down and some creatures, and then you play Boon-Bringer Valkyrie, and you back up Etali, you give it flying and first strike and lifelink, you hit your opponent for like 8 damage in the air, gain a ton of life, and probably just win the game on the spot. That's super, super strong. The question is, does this beat out the other cards that can do this? We actually have like multiple planeswalkers in Standard that can do the same thing, just like putting a creature to the air to deal a bunch of damage. Archangel Elspeth, for example, which I still think is a sleeper. I think this card is better than people give it credit for. Can just come down -2, send Etali to the air, get in a bunch of damage. Elspeth Resplendent, until rotation at least, can do the same thing with its +1 essentially. Whether or not Boon-Bringer Valkyrie can beat out these cards in a generic sense, that remains to be seen. It is worth mentioning though, Angels are still a thing. Like, Streets of New Capenna's around. We still got Gyata. We still got Sanctuary Warden. We still got Archangel of Wrath. And at various times, we've seen Angel decks be successful in Standard. Maybe Angels make a comeback with another powerful new Angel in the mix. I think worst case, the floor on Boon-Bringer Valkyrie is essentially just being a Baneslayer Angel, which means sideboard all-star. One of the powers of Baneslayer, and last time we had Baneslayer Angel in Standard not that long ago, its main purpose was to chill on your sideboard. You're playing mid-range, you're playing control, hangs out in your sideboard, you run into mono red, you bring in Baneslayer, and your opponent just can't win the game. They can't really kill it, the lifelink keeps them from really doing anything, and you just win with Baneslayer. That's the worst case for Boon-Bringer Valkyrie. We got Phyrexian Vindicator, which does something similar, but it costs 4 white mana, which is a ton. Boon-Bringer Valkyrie, a little more possible to cast. So I think that's the worst case. Worst case, the card doesn't make it in main decks. It shows up in sideboards, comes in against aggro and just wrecks people. Best case, maybe Angels make a comeback, or maybe it can beat out one of the Elspeths to be a main deck card in Standard. We also got Voldaren Thrillseeker, our red backup rare. So with 3 mana 1/1, Vampire Warrior, it has backup 2. So this time you get 2 +1/+1 counters. And the ability is pay 1, sack this creature. It deals damage equal to its power to any target. So this is essentially a weird twist on Fling. Like, you play Thrillseeker, you back up a creature, you put 2 counters on it, and then for 1 mana, you can fling that creature at whatever you want. Your opponent's face, one of their creatures, a battle to flip the battle and defeat the battle, which is a pretty interesting possibility. Obviously, the dream, the against the odds dream, which I'm sure we're going to have to try to pull off, is Voldaren Thrillseeker into Yargle and Mutani, or actually the opposite direction. Yargle and Mutani into Voldaren Thrillseeker. You get the 18/6 Yargle and Mutani, then you Thrillseeker, you put the 2 counters on it, 20 power, 1 mana, sack the Yargle and Mutani, fling it at your opponent's face, 20 damage, win the game. So that's the sweetest thing to do with this card. Although honestly, like, I don't know, could you just play this in mono red and your opponent gets low on life and you just throw a Swift Spear at him for 3 damage or a Felding for 4 damage? That doesn't seem that bad. Like, that's fine. And then you still have the Thrillseeker hanging out for future purposes. Could also be an interesting sack outlet. Like, if your creatures actively want to die, I don't know, back up your Atsushi, throw it for 6 damage, and you get its death trigger. Or Suchi, Cave Guardian, make a ton of mana, get a ton of damage. We also still have vampires hanging out. We haven't really seen vampires be a real deck in Standard, but remember, the Innistrad stats are still legal until rotation, and they have a lot of vampire support. So maybe Voldaren Thrillseeker can bring back Evelyn and Olivia's and Florian's and give them another shot in Standard. So Voldaren Thrillseeker, I can't wait to try to combo off with Yargle. That seems like the sweetest thing to do with this card. But I think the mechanic in general is actually pretty interesting. I just love the idea of being able to give abilities to other creatures. Super, super cool idea. Back to the world of mashups. We got a mono green mashup in Surrak and Goreclaw. So 6 mana, 6/5, legendary human bear has trample. Your other creatures have trample. And when a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains haste until end of turn. So this card, I don't think it's all that good, but it is flavorful. You get the haste of Surrak, then you get the trample and +1/+1 counter ability of Goreclaw. You mash them all together on a really big body, and it seems like the kind of card that can close out games. Like, if there was a world, which we don't live in this world, but if there was a world in Standard where you could just like play this and untap with it and dump your hand, you're probably going to win the game. Although I don't think it's likely to actually happen. Its ability is actually actually kind of first day of class, essentially, on a static, on a creature that has a pretty big body, which is a powerful effect. Like, again, if you untap with this and have a handful of cards and can just give them counters and haste in your creatures, you're probably going to kill your opponent. That said, green is the worst color in Standard, and there is a lot of competition. Like, in such a removal heavy Standard, I don't know if you can just run out Surrak and Goreclaw and hope that it lives, when you could play Lavabrink Caretaker, which has hexproof and isn't as likely to die. You could play Tovalar's Huntmaster, which at least leaves behind some tokens if it's gonna die. You could play like Nissa's and try to trample it up and win the game that way. So it just doesn't seem like a Standard card. It could be cool in Commander, though, played in +1/+1 counter decks, giving all your things a +1/+1 counter. It works out with like Vorinclex, proliferate strategies like Azuri, maybe Hamas for some ramp, or you could just play it as your commander and play the biggest green things possible, like playing Surrak and then Gulting and having it come down with haste and a counter and smashing your opponent, or Ashayas or Grothramas or Greensleeves, whatever big crawl wormy green dorks you like. This is a really sweet commander for that. So Surrak and Goreclaw, love the flavor, probably not strong enough for Standard though. We also got Chrome Host Seedshark, which is a pretty spicy one. So 3 mana 2/4 flying Phyrexian shark, and its ability is when you cast a non-creature spell, incubate X, where X is that spell's mana value. So if you cast a 2 mana non-creature spell, you're going to get a incubate with 2 counters that you can flip up for 2 mana. If you cast a 10 mana non-creature spell, an Omniscience, you're going to get 10 counters on that incubate that you can flip up. So this is essentially a Shark Typhoon at half the price, but I guess with a couple of downsides. One downside is your incubates don't have flying. The other downside is to actually turn your incubates into creatures, you're going to need to spend mana on them. So compared to Young Pyromancers, other Spellslinger type cards, that is the biggest drawback. Young Pyromancer, let's say, you cast a spell, you get a creature, Chrome Host Seedshark. You cast a spell, you get a random artifact that if you have 2 extra mana, you can turn into a creature. That doesn't mean it's bad, but it is going to take some building around, I think, to really take advantage of it. It's not going to stabilize you the way some of these other cards do. It is worth pointing out that its stats are pretty good. I believe Righteous Valkyrie is the only other 3 mana 2/4 flyer without a huge downside. So it does have pretty reasonable stats to tangle in combat and get in for some damage in the air. So how do you actually build around this? And I think the most obvious, well, 2 ways. One way is to try to get around having to spend 2 mana to transform all your incubators by doing it automatically with like Glissa. New Glissa can just, at beginning of combat, transform all your incubator tokens. So you make a bunch of incubators with your Chrome Host Seedshark, then you Glissa, and you just turn them all into creatures to win the game. Also, Elesh Norn, we talked about that earlier. The backside of Elesh Norn can transform all of your incubators. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is just to not care about turning them into creatures, or at least all of them, by playing stuff that just cares about artifacts on the battlefield. We've seen this with food, and we've seen this with clues. The part of the value of these cards is they're just an artifact on the battlefield. Maybe you want to have affinity synergies, or maybe you have whatever, anything that cares about just a mass of artifacts. Chrome Host Seedshark is going to give you that. Every time you cast a non-creature spell, you're getting an artifact on the battlefield, and that's triggering your Dragon Spark Reactor. It's growing your Cephalopod Sentry. In older formats, you got Broodstar and actual affinity cards. You got Halkite Igniter, which gets massive. You got Master of Ethereum, which gets massive. So that's the other plan. Maybe you don't try to flip all your incubates and just use them as artifacts on the battlefield. So card's very interesting to me. I think the fact that you got to spend 2 mana to actually flip your incubates is going to keep it from being an all-star, but I certainly can see some sweet purposes for this card. We also got Terror of Towashi, which I almost just dumped in with the bulk rares, but I want to mention for one reason. So a 4 mana 4/3 Phyrexian Ogre, it has Death Touch. When it attacks, you can pay for it. If you do, reanimate a creature from your graveyard. It's a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. So this is a creature that's a repeatable zombify, essentially, every time you attack with this, and it doesn't even need to get in damage. You just need to attack. You can pay for and reanimate something. Seems kind of sweet. The only issue is the body's not that good, and this is going to trade-off, and it doesn't do anything right away. You gotta play this, wait for it not to be summoning sick, and attack with it, and have something in the graveyard, and have 4 extra mana. The big issue I have with this card is it kind of feels like Archpriest of Shadows, but just like way worse. At least Archpriest, I can back up another creature, maybe reanimate right away. Yes, I know the upside is Terror of Towashi. You can pay 4 mana and get that reanimation even if it gets blocked. That is a difference, but it looks pretty bad to me compared to Archpriest of Shadows. And Archpriest of Shadows, remember, was another card we were kind of like, maybe in the right situation it could see play, but is it actually better than Cruelty of Gix or whatever? So I would be surprised if Terror of Towashi was beating out Shieldrids and actually seeing standard play. But if you got kind of a medium-powered reanimation deck in Commander, could be a cool and fun addition there. We also got Orthion, Hero of Lavabrink. So 4 mana red legendary human soldier. It's a 3/3. You can pay 1 in a red, tap it, make a token that's a copy of another target creature you control. It gains a second of being the end step, activate it only as a sorcery, or you can pay 9 mana and tap it and create 5 tokens that are copies of another target creature you control. They gain haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step, activate only as a sorcery. So Orthion does not really look like a standard card to me. It calls back to like Kiki Jiki, but again without the combo potential because you have to spend mana on it. Very similar to Jaxus. That might be the closest comparison, but Jaxus does make you discard a card to use its ability, kind of like a Reflections of Kiki Jiki if you manage to flip around your Reflections. Orthion's very similar to that. At 4 mana and without haste and needing to untap and only being a 3/3, I would be surprised if this could see standard play. Like, if Jaxus isn't good enough for standard and you can blitz it into play for 2 mana, I would be shocked if Orthion was. On the other hand, the fact that you can, for 9 mana, do this red Rite of Replication where you're getting 5 copies of a creature, that seems so much fun in Commander. I would love to build a Commander deck around this, or a Historic Brawl deck around this. Imagine just like 5 Combat Celebrants and taking all the combats. Imagine 5 Combustible Gearhulks, how much damage, how many cards you draw, maybe 5 Molten Primordials, and you steal all your opponent's things. So it seems like a super fun card, but I think it's just a little bit too slow, a little bit too understated to really be a standard card. We also got a new Lord. A surprise Lord, a Phyrexian Lord in Grafted Butcher. So Grafted Butcher, 2 mana 2/2, Phyrexian Samurai. When it enters the battlefield, your Phyrexians gain menace until end of turn. Other Phyrexians get +1/+1, and you can pay 4, sack an artifact or creature, return it from your graveyard to the battlefield only as a sorcery. Wow, Grafted Butcher is a very powerful lord. Like, if you look at what you want in a strong tribal lord in Magic, 2 mana is the sweet spot. You want additional upsides. Grafted Butcher is all of those things. It has multiple upsides. It comes back from the graveyard. It's only 2 mana. The only question is, like, do Phyrexians need a lord? Is Phyrexian tribal a thing? We've never had Phyrexian be a tribe before. We only recently really started getting Phyrexians in Magic, and there's never been anything that made you want to put a bunch of Phyrexians together in a deck. Is Grafted Butcher going to change that? Like, is this a reason to make sure that all your creatures are Phyrexian? I think the answer might be yes. We do have a lot of Phyrexians in Standard from last set, and we're going to get even more in March of the Machines, and some of these cards are pretty good. Skrelvs and Evolved Sleepers and Venerated Rotpriests and Annex Entries and Elesh Norns. There's a lot of strong Phyrexians. Grafted Butcher seems like a really easy addition to a deck like that to just grow your team a bit. You could potentially even go Phyrexian tokens, like Mondrax of Phyrexian, Skrelv's Hive makes Phyrexian tokens, White Sun's Twilight. All the Incubates are Phyrexians once you flip them, so that's another interesting direction to go. So there's multiple ways to build around this card in Standard, and when you think about it, like we just had back in Dominaria United, this cycle of 5 lords for iconic tribes. Valiant Veterans seeing a ton of Standard play. We've seen all except for the Cleric Lord show up in like Modern and Pioneer. Grafted Butcher is on this power level. Honestly, I would argue that Grafted Butcher, if you just read the text on this card, it's probably better than these lords for the most part. The only question is, do we have enough Phyrexians or enough desire to put all the Phyrexians together to make a deck? I think this card's going to change things though. Like, I think we will see people try to build straight up Phyrexian tribal decks. I'm going to try to build straight up Phyrexian tribal. We'll see how good that is. Is that going to be an actual legit standard deck or like a fun budget Magic deck? That I'm not sure, but I do think this card is a worthy lord for the Phyrexian tribe and a reason to put them all together in a deck. Back in the world of mashups, we got Baral and Kari Zev, 3 mana 2/4 legendary human. It has first strike and menace, and it says when you cast your first instant or sorcery spell each turn, you may cast a spell with lesser mana value that shares a card type with it from your hand without paying its mana cost. If you don't, create First Mate Ragavan, a legendary 2/1 monkey pirate creature token. It gains haste until end of turn. So this mashes together the spell synergies of Baral with the aggressive and monkey aspect of Kari Zev's Skyship Raider, and I think this card's actually pretty sweet. If you think about it, yes, there is some world where you like combo off with it and sling a bunch of spells. Imagine like we have Belmore in Monastery Swiftspear, Third Path Iconoclast in Standard. You take in like cast a Thirst of Discovery, trigger all your stuff, and then get a free Impulse, which triggers all of your stuff, or it's on your opponent's turn and you cast the Impulse and trigger all your stuff, and then you get a free Consider to trigger all your stuff and keep churning through your deck. That seems really strong. Definitely interested in like a Is It Prowess Spellslinger, or maybe Jeskai Prowess Spellslinger deck with Baral and Kari Zev being a big payoff to the deck. On the other hand, it can also just be a fine, weird aggro card. Like, maybe your goal isn't to sling a ton of spells. Maybe your goal is just to sling a single spell to make a monkey with haste and start smashing your opponent. Like, if you play Baral and Kari Zev and then cast 1 Consider or 1 Play with Fire and get a 2/1, technically for 3 mana and I guess 4 mana because you got to cast a spell, but you're getting a total of 4 power and 5 toughness across 2 bodies. And then if Ragavan dies, you're able to take and just cast another spell and replenish it. So I actually think Baral and Kari Zev is a pretty powerful card. Like, it's got a decent body, it's got reasonable stats, it's got a ton of abilities on it. It can be good in Spellslinger, it can be good in some sort of like burn or more aggro style deck. So actually pretty impressed with this card for 60 card formats. Speaking of mashups, we also got Rankle and Torbran, a 5 mana, double black, double red, 3/4 flying fairy dwarf. It has flying, first strike, and haste. It says when it deals combat damage to a player battle, choose any number. Each player creates a treasure token, each player sacks a creature, or if a source would deal damage to our player battle this turn, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. So you can do all of those every turn, although you probably won't want to. Giving a treasure token may or may not be good because your opponent's getting one as well. Sacking a creature going to depend on what your board state's like, what your opponent's board state's like. That last ability looks weird, but I think that's actually the biggest payoff on this card. So this combines together the damage of Torbran, the +2 damage, with Rankle's hasty sacrifice ability and flying. And if you mash these all together, you end up with a pretty strong card. So the last ability on this card, it definitely looks weird. Like, why would you want to hit your opponent with a creature to give all your sources +2 damage? You've already gotten to combat. The trick here is first strike. It's very similar to Durana, Liberator of Malakir, in that because Rankle and Torbran has first strike, what you can do is swing with your whole team. Rankle and Torbran will hit first, you trigger that ability, and then all of your Blood Tithe Harvesters and Monastery Swiftspears and Fable the Mirrorbreakers or whatever that are dealing normal damage are going to be +2 damage by the time they actually hit your opponent. So I think that last ability, combined with flying in first strike and haste and this coming down by surprise, is just gonna close out games and kill people. Like, yes, 5 mana for a 3/4, not the best stats, it is a lot of mana, but in some sort of Rakdos aggro deck, I think this card is legitimately scary. The sacrifice mode, we've seen Razorlash Churn's Mogrant really increase in Standard recently. Right now it's like the 2nd most played creature in the format. Rankle and Torbran synergize really well with that. You can kind of sack that for free, keep getting it back from the graveyard. card and hopefully eat away one of your opponent's real creatures, so that's another upside. So I think Rankle and Torbran definitely has a shot to be a very good standard card. Outside of standard, probably a little bit too much mana, a little skeptical, but at least in standard, I think that this card is probably going to be able to just kill people by surprise thanks to its combination of haste and flying and pretty sneaky strong abilities. Next up, we got the return of Polukranos in Polukranos Reborn, another transform card. So the front side, 3 mana 4/5 legendary Hydra with reach. It is triple green mana, worth pointing out. And then you can pay 6 in a Phyrexian white mana to transform it only as a sorcery. The backside is Polukranos Engine of Ruin, a 6/6 legendary Phyrexian Hydra with reach and lifelink. And it says, when it or another non-token Hydra you control dies, create a 3/3 green and white Phyrexian Hydra creature token with reach and a 3/3 green and white Phyrexian Hydra creature token with lifelink. And my god, this is another card that is ridiculous. If you think about what this is a Leatherback Baloth, which I know it's been a long time since Leatherback Baloth was kind of an all-star, but it's a Leatherback Baloth, a creature with good stats, and it's upgraded with reach that flips around into essentially a Wurmcoil engine. The backside is more or less Wurmcoil. Like, if it dies, you get 2 3/3s, you trade, I guess, reach for Death Touch on one of them. It also has the upside that if you have other Hydras somehow, it is even better. If those Hydras die, you can sacrifice them and combo off or whatever. But this just seems like a really powerful card. The only problem with this card is green just hasn't been good in standard, and since Polukranos is triple green, you really gotta be very close to mono green to actually make Polukranos work. Like, we have a lot of pieces though. I've been hyped every set for the last like 2 or 3 sets. I'm like, okay, this is the set. Green's gonna be good. We got Thrun, we got Bloated Contaminator, we got Silverback Elder, we got Nissa. Maybe Polukranos is finally the card that puts mono green over the top in standard. It does seem really strong. Like, it's good on the front side, and the back side is absolutely ridiculous if you can get to it. So we'll have to wait and see if this is a card that can actually put green over the top. In older formats, I'm pretty excited about this card there as well. Mono green aggro would certainly love this. Like, mono green Stompy, one of my favorite old school budget decks in Modern. You got Aspect of the Hydra to just give a creature like +10/+10 or something absurd. Polukranos, plus you got Steel Leaf Champion, and then Polukranos, if you flood out a little bit, maybe you flip it into Wurmcoil. The other place this interests me is in mono green Devotion. Mono green Devotion already plays Old Growth Troll, and there's certainly upside to Old Growth Troll. If it dies, it comes back. You get to keep its mana symbols going, which is very powerful to fight through removal. The upside of Polukranos, though, is in a green Devotion deck, you make so much mana that you're going to get to Wurmcoil mode super quickly, and Wurmcoil mode is going to beat a lot of decks by itself. Like, a 6/6 reach lifelinker that leaves behind those tokens when it dies, that's going to be enough to kill a lot of Pioneer decks. So I think mono green Devotion could be in the market for this as well. So Polukranos, the card seems very powerful. You need a lot of green mana, but if you can make its mana cost work, it's good on the front side, it's good on the back side, and it'll probably be a fun Hydra commander as well. Speaking of the return of fan favorites, we also got a new Etali, an Etali Primal Conqueror, which again, another transform card, transforms into Etali Primal Sickness. So front side, 7 mana, 7/7 legendary Elder Dinosaur with Trample. When it ETBs, each player exiles cards from the top of their library till they hit a non-land card, and you get to cast any number of those without paying their mana cost. Then you can pay 9 in a Phyrexian green mana to transform it into a 11/11 trampling indestructible creature that says when it deals combat damage to a player, they get that many poison counters. If this card seems familiar, well, the front side is kind of like Etali Primal Storm, except upgraded in a bunch of ways. Etali Primal Storm, it's got to attack to get its trigger, and you only get the top card, so it could whiff and hit lands that don't do anything. Etali Primal Conqueror, not going to be repeatable each turn, but you are guaranteed to hit a non-land card from each player with its ETB trigger. So you're getting that value right away. In a 1v1 format, that's kind of okay. You might just be getting some random, 2-drop from your opponent or whatever, a ramp spell from your own deck. But in a commander game, getting a free card from everyone's deck and knowing you're not going to hit a land, that's a lot of value. The backside, it's literally Blightsteel Clauses. Like, Trample indestructible, 11/11, damage, poison counters. Like, it's Blightsteel. It's Dinosaur Blightsteel Colossus. It is literally Dinosaur Blightsteel Colossus. So one of my challenges for this set is going to be to get someone with Dino Blightsteel in Standard. I don't know if this is actually like a super powerful card for Standard. It's a lot of mana. Like, to get to Blightsteel mode, you got to pay the 7 mana mode, and then you got to flip it for 9 or 10 more mana. That is a big ass, but if you can pull it off, it is a hilarious way to poison someone out of the game. We also got a new Glissa in Glissa Herald of Predation, a 5 mana Golgari 3/5 legendary Phyrexian zombie elf. So at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose one. Incubate 2 twice. So make 2 incubates, each with 2 counters. Transform all incubator tokens you control. Really powerful in the right deck. Or Phyrexias you control. Get First Strike and Death Touch until end of turn. And remember, your incubates, once they turn into creatures, they are Phyrexian. So you get a little bit of a self-contained value there. So Glissa is a card, if this sticks on the battlefield, it is going to overwhelm your opponent and win the game, like Grave Titan style. You play this, the first turn, you incubate. The next turn, you flip your incubates, or maybe you have the mana to flip them, so you incubate some more. And then eventually, after you get a big board of Phyrexians, you give them First Strike and Death Touch, so they're almost impossible for your opponent to interact with in combat and just win the game. And I really like that this triggers at the beginning of combat, so you get that first trigger right away. You don't gotta wait until the next turn. So that does help Glissa do something even against removal. I think there's a couple of ways to take advantage of this card. One is there's been some cards we've talked about, like Chromos Seedshark. They can make a lot of incubates, but you're not going to have the mana to actually flip them. Like, that's one of the drawbacks of these incubates is 2 mana is a lot. Like, Norn's Inquisitor, the incubates 2, do you really want to spend 2 mana to make a 2/2? That doesn't seem great. Glissa gets around all that. One of the only 2 cards we've seen so far that just transform your incubators without mana. So I think that is one of Glissa's main goals. The other thing this does is works really well with Phyrexians. Like, technically the incubates are Phyrexians, but even in just a Phyrexian tribal deck like Grafted Butcher, Cankerbloom, Shieldred, Phyrexian Obliterator, giving your team First Strike and Death Touch is going to make it really easy to kill your opponent. Like, it's only going to take 1 or 2 attacks, and you're either going to wrath away your opponent's entire board as they jump block, or you're just going to straight up kill them with damage. So I think that maybe there's some sort of Golgari Phyrexian deck that Glissa could be the leader of there as well. So Glissa, 5 mana, a little expensive compared to plastic Glissas, but I think it actually has a lot of potential because if this can stick on the battlefield, it just wins the game all by itself. We also got what might be one of the most important cards for this set, both for Against the Odds and also for Commander, in Realmbreaker, the Invasion Tree. So 3 mana legendary artifact, pay 2 tap it, target opponent mills 3 cards, put a land card from their graveyard onto the battlefield tapped under your control. It gains, if this land would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. So you can't just keep sniping the same fetch land over and over again, essentially. And then the fun mode, pay 10, sack it, search your library for any number of Praetor cards, put them on the battlefield, and then shuffle. So let's start with the fun part. Realmbreaker, the Invasion Tree, kind of calls back to World Tree. Remember World Tree fixing our mana and then letting us pay 10 mana to put any number of gods into play? Realmbreaker can do the same thing. And what I cannot wait to do with this is just play it, ramp up to 10 mana, which it helps do with its ability, and try to put every single Praetor on the battlefield. That sounds ridiculously sweet. We got, what, 15 Praetors now, presumably, by the time we get the rest of March of the Machines. Putting them all into play at once, it is going to be hilarious, it is going to be awesome, and that is what I want to do with this card. You can also obviously play 5-color Praetors in Commander, or whatever format you want to, and it is going to be super fun. You can also play it as a mill card. In Standard, there's not a lot of good mill. We got Jace, which is a really good mill card, but the backup mill is not great, and pay 2 to mill 3, not really efficient. But beggars can't be choosers, and in Standard, if you're trying to mill, you really gotta make use with whatever you can, and every little bit helps. The place that I think this card is gonna shine competitively, though, is in Commander, where this might be the best colorless ramp spell. One thing we've talked about a lot is how green is really good at ramping, because it gets land ramp, while the other colors get ramp that is temporary, because it gets blown up by artifact hate. Realmbreaker, the Invasion Tree, once you get it going, should would be pay 2 rampant growth, essentially. Yes, you could get unlucky. Maybe your opponents don't have any lands in their graveyard somehow, or you whiff, but you also get a ton of upside where this can hit non-basic lands. It can be milling and getting Field of the Deads and Cabal Coffers and dual lands, shock lands, whatever. So I think this is almost an auto-include in commander decks that don't have access to green ramp. Like, this seems so good. It's a little slow to get going. The first land you get is 5 mana, but then after that, it gets better and better. The second land's gonna be 7 total mana. The third one's 9 total mana. So you're only paying 2 for each future land, and the fact that it gets non-basics helps make up for that drawback. So if you're a non-green deck, I think this is a really integral part of your ramp suite. Yes, you probably still need some arcane signets and Orzhov signets and Celestis or whatever, but getting a card that puts actual lands on the battlefield is a huge deal for these colors, because it's giving you a way to ramp that isn't just going to get blown up by the first artifact haste spell. So Realmbreaker, one of my favorite cards from the entire set. I cannot wait to try to put all the Praetors into play, and I'm planning on jamming this in a ton of commander decks. We also got the return of Quintorius as Quintorius Lore Master, and Quintorius has gotten a lot better since last time we saw him. 5 mana, 3/5, Elephant Cleric. It's a legend. It has Vigilance. It says at the beginning of your end step, exile target non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard, and you create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. So assuming you got something in your graveyard to exile, this comes down as a 3/5, immediately makes a 3/2. So you're getting 6 power and 7 toughness across 2 bodies right away, and that can snowball every single turn. So just on stats, it's not bad. And then its other ability is pay 3, tap it, sack a spirit. You can choose a card that's exiled with it and cast it without paying its mana cost, and it goes on the bottom of your library. So this is calling back to Quintorius, making the 3/2 spirit tokens, and they do kind of synergize together. You can remove cards from your graveyard with new Quintorius to turn your old Quintorius. So Quintorius Tribal maybe could be kind of fun. Not probably effective, but it would be kind of fun. But new Quintorius, the exciting part about this card is the ability to cast those things for free. If you think about this, this is giving you a tenacious underdog worth of stats every turn, assuming you got something to exile from your graveyard, starting from the first turn you play it. So as token production, it's good, but then you can potentially be filling your graveyard with Fable the Mirror Breakers, Big Scores, Blood Tithe Harvesters. These are already really good cards in Standard, and then maybe casting a One with the Multiverse or Portal to Phyrexia for free. I guess it's technically 3 mana to activate Quintorius, but still, we've had some success playing like Capricious Hellraiser, trying to randomly cast a One with the Multiverse or Portal to Phyrexia from the graveyard. Quintorius, it's a little slower, but it's not random. You have more control over it. So I'm super hyped to build a Quintorius Hellraiser deck, put them both together, and just try to cheat the biggest things into play possible with their abilities. So Quintorius, I really like this card. It is super cool. Another card to that at 5 mana. You got to be in the right deck to take advantage of this, but if you are in that deck, this card has a lot of power and can snowball really quickly. Rounding out our rares from the day, we got 4 more that I'm not going to go into in depth. Not that these cards are bad, they're just not the most interesting. Essence of Orthodoxy. Whenever it or Phyrexian enters the battlefield, you incubate 2, 5 mana, 3/3 flying. Not a horrible card in like Phyrexian Tribal, but a little bit slow. 3/3 flying for 5, not great. Interdisciplinary Mascot. 8 mana, 5/5, but it has Convoke, so you can tap creatures to pay for it in Ward 3, so it's going to be hard to deal with. And when it ETBs, you essentially Impulse, look at your top 4 cards, snag one of them, the rest go to the bottom. If there's a deck that can Convoke this out on the cheap, could be worth it. Like, an Impulse on a body is a powerful effect, but you are going to have to tap a lot of creatures or pay a lot of mana. Guardian of Gerper, kind of a blinky angel, worse than something like Restoration Angel because it doesn't return the artifact or creature it blinks until end of turn, so it's more of a Flicker Wisp, except it's a Flicker Wisp that can't interact with your opponent's stuff, so you lose some of the value of Flicker Wisp. Still, if you're trying to blink stuff for value, it's only 3 mana, and a 3/3 flyer is reasonable stat, so it's definitely not bad at that job. And then Transcendent Message, 4 blue and X, instant, draw X cards, except it has Convoke, so much like interdisciplinary mascot, if you can go wide enough, this card can be kinda busted. And I think in Commander, this might be the new best Blue Sun Zenith, because most Commander decks, unless you're like hardcore control spellslinger, you're gonna have some creatures laying around. And if you can tap creatures to pay for this, you can draw a ridiculous amount of cards at instant speed. So I think this card has a lot of potential, but it's essentially just another variant on Blue Sun Zenith with Convoke thrown in. Although, don't underestimate Convoke, that is a really powerful mechanic. We also got the 5 face cards from the 5 Commander precon decks. I'm not going to go into all these cards at all, because Tomer covered them over on the Commander channel. So if you want a full breakdown of these new face commanders, one for each deck, I'll link the video in the description. Make sure to check out Tomer's video going over all these cards and their Commander ramifications. In the world of lower rarity cards, again, a ton of commons and uncommons, but we don't have time to go into all of them. We've already been going over cards for more than an hour, so make sure to check them out over at mtgpreviews.com. There is some interesting stuff in the lower rarity slots. There are a couple, though, I wanted to mention. Halo Forager. This card seems absurd to me. 3 mana, 3/1 Flying Fairy Rogue. It's a Dimir card. When it ETBs, you can pay X. When you do, you may cast target instant or sorcery card with mana value X from a graveyard without paying its mana cost, and then if the spell would go to a graveyard, you exile it instead. So this is a sorcery speed snapcaster on Elite Spellbinder's body, essentially, which people underestimate. A 3/1 flying body for 3, that has traditionally been a pretty effective beater in Magic. So I think the body is actually legit. And then you can hit your opponent's graveyard, which is fun, but also kind of competitive. I'm imagining, like, in Modern, let's say, your opponent living ends. You can play this and just steal the living end and wrath away all the stuff they just put into play. So being able to cast the no mana value cards, or like a Crashing Footfalls, flashing that back for free seems really powerful. Plus, fairies and rogues are both relevant creature types. I think this card actually has a shot all the way back to maybe Vintage, where you're flashing back Ancestral Recalls and Demonic Tutors. Certainly a cube all-star, so keep this one in mind, even though it's an uncommon. To me, this looks like one of the most fun and potentially most powerful cards from the set. We also got land cycling making a return, which is interesting, just because in the past, stuff that swamp cycles, mountain cycles for 2 mana on these big bodies has actually been pretty good. So if you're trying to fix your mana in limited or maybe even in standard, these cards are probably a bit better than their stats and mana value look. Seal from Existence, actually a really solid take on an Oblivion Ring. 3 mana enchantment, ETBs, exile and non-land an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. The upgrade here is it has Ward 3, so it's actually going to be a little tricky for opponents to deal with, although right now, Invoke Despair is still a thing, so maybe the ward is not that valuable at the moment, but at least once that rotates, keep this one in mind, because having an Oblivion Ring effect that actually has some protection is a big upgrade. And then Botanical Brawler, this card just scares me. 2 mana 0/0 comes into play with 2+1/+1 counters. It has trample, and it says whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on another permanent you control, if it's the first time a +1/+1 counter have been put on that permanent this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Botanical Brawler. So this isn't a once per turn restriction. This is a once per permanent per turn restriction. And why this scares me is the combination of incubates and other +1/+1 counter stuff, and also proliferate. How this works is if you have like 3 or 4 incubates on the battlefield or creatures with counters, you can have Botanical Brawler. You can proliferate. You put a counter on everything. For each permanent that you put a counter on, you're also going to get a counter on Botanical Brawler. So it seems pretty easy in a proliferate counter shenanigan deck for this to end up being a 2 mana 10/10 trample relatively quickly if you're built around it. So this to me feels like the kind of uncommon that is worthy of building a deck around and can actually do some pretty ridiculous things, kind of like Generous Visitor was for the enchantment deck once Kamigawa came out. I could see this being that signpost uncommon that actually can make waves in Constructed just thanks to its ability to get really, really big while interacting well with the set's mechanic. Last but definitely not least, we got a bunch of Multiverse Legends. So these are the Strixhaven Mystical Archives or Brothers War retro artifacts of the set, where you open a pack, you're going to get one of these in each pack, and they are all legendary creatures creatures. So the way I broke these down is in 3 piles. First, we just got the Praetors, which are kind of iconic Phyrexians. Then we have cards where their legality doesn't really change at all. Emrys and Nivs and Croxes and Yargles and Thalias. These cards are legal in all the same places they were before, so you're just getting like super sweet new Secret Lair showcase style art for these cards. Then we have a few cards whose legality does change on Magic Arena. So cards like Skithiryx, for example, this will be its first time being put on Arena, which means it's going to be legal in Historic, it's going to be legal in Historic Brawl, and I think that's actually relevant. Like in a Toxic deck or Poison deck, this is a pretty real threat. I would build a Historic Poison deck with Skittles, trying to come down with haste and poison people out of the game. Same with Zada, just some really fun combos. I'm sure it's going to be a super sweet Historic Brawl commander. Hirobi's Death's Whale was kind of an interesting build around, and then we got some Commander Precon cards that have never made their way onto the client before. So these cards are all going to be legal in Historic Brawl, also Alchemy if you're one of the dozens of people that play that format, but they actually do change in legality based on this reprinting, unlike the other cards we were talking about, which are essentially just some nice blingy upgrades. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily spoilers for today, and oh my literal god, longest spoiler video of all time, most exciting set of all time. Like, these cards are ridiculous and busted, battles are absurd, the mashups are absurd, there's so many above the curves cards. This set, Wizards pulled out all the stops. They are going all the way. This is going to be an all-timer. I am incredibly hyped. I'm also losing my voice, apologies for that, but this set looks amazing and awesome, and I cannot wait to see more of it tomorrow and also start playing with it. It just looks so incredibly fun, but I want to know what you think. If you actually stuck around this long to see the entire video, thank you, and also let me know, what are you most hyped about now that we've seen this big chunk of the set? What are you most excited for? What do you think of battles, the other new mechanics? Let me know in the comments. So anyway, I'm gonna go and rest my voice and get ready for tomorrow's equally epic spoiler video. Hopefully not quite as epic. We could use a few less spoilers. So until then, everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back tomorrow with more daily March of the Machine spoilers. So until then, have a great one, and I will talk to you soon.